The night sky above Manhattan burned a soft violet, the color of a bruise that had almost finished healing. Peter Parker crouched on the edge of a rusted water tower, chest rising and falling beneath the thin fabric of his suit. Below him, the city hummed with its familiar chorus of sirens, laughter, and distant traffic. He had just wrapped up another routine encounter, a low-level thief with a stolen device that pulsed like a wounded heart. The machine had cracked open in his hands, spilling light he could not name, and for one weightless instant the world had folded inward like paper caught in flame. Then silence, then falling, then a city he did not recognize. He landed on a rooftop that felt too still, too heavy, as if the air itself carried a warning. The skyline was familiar in the way a distorted photograph is familiar. Skyscrapers loomed in the same places, yet their windows glowed with unfamiliar logos. Enormous screens dominated every avenue, displaying polished faces in bright capes, their smiles rehearsed to the millimeter. A single word repeated across every billboard, glowing like a corporate hymn: Vought. Peter tilted his head, trying to make sense of the letters. He had traveled through strange places before. He had faced doppelgangers, gods, and the occasional interdimensional squid. Yet this world unsettled him in a way none of those had. It was not the architecture that felt wrong. It was the mood. The city breathed like something afraid of being noticed. He dropped down into an alley and moved carefully toward the street. People walked with their shoulders drawn inward, eyes fixed on the sidewalk. A child holding a red balloon paused only to be tugged forward by a nervous parent. A pair of officers stood beside a squad car, but they did not watch the crowd. They watched the sky. Peter followed their gaze and saw a figure gliding above the rooftops. The man wore a costume that shimmered with patriotic colors, cape rippling as though obedient to some invisible director. Civilians below did not cheer. They stiffened. A woman pulled her son closer as if the sight of a hero were more dangerous than any criminal. Something twisted inside Peter's chest. In his world, capes meant comfort. Here, they meant caution. He climbed the wall of a shuttered bookstore, seeking the anonymity of the higher levels, and listened. Through the open windows, he caught fragments of conversation. Debts. Layoffs. A neighbor who had vanished after speaking too loudly about a hero named Homelander. The name landed in his mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending quiet ripples outward. Farther down the block, glass shattered. A convenience store alarm shrieked into the night. Two masked figures burst from the entrance with bags clutched to their chests. Peter did not think. He never did in these moments. His body moved before his mind caught up, the familiar snap of webbing releasing from his wrist with the certainty of breath. He landed between the thieves and the fleeing customers, disarmed them with practiced ease, and secured them to a lamppost with 3 efficient strands. It took less than 20 seconds. The store owner stumbled out, pale and shaking, and the small crowd that had gathered burst into applause. Peter raised a hand in a modest wave, expecting relief, perhaps gratitude. Instead, a young man near the front lifted his phone and grinned. "Which company is he with?" the man asked. "Vought Plus or the new streaming branch?" "Must be a stunt," a woman replied. "The cameras are probably hidden somewhere. Look at the suit. Independent contractor, maybe. They are testing new heroes for the fall lineup." Peter's arm lowered slowly. The applause was not for the rescue. It was for the show. They believed the entire moment had been staged, that the thieves were actors, that the fear on the owner's face was a rehearsal. Their gratitude was as thin as paper, printed for whoever owned the network. He backed away and slipped into the shadows before questions began. On a fire escape 3 stories up, he sat with his mask pulled slightly free of his jaw, letting cool air touch his skin. He had crossed dimensions before, but never one so quietly ruined. Crime still lived here. Fear still lived here. Yet the beings meant to guard against those things had become brands, faces on cups and lunchboxes, gods sponsored by shareholders. His enhanced hearing drifted across the city. He caught snatches of news broadcasts praising the Seven, a team he had never heard of, their achievements listed with the rhythm of advertisements. He caught whispers about Homelander, some reverent, most terrified. He heard a father tell his daughter that heroes were only real in her storybooks, and the true ones on television were something else entirely. Peter closed his eyes. Uncle Ben's voice returned to him as it always did in unfamiliar silence: responsibility. The word had guided him through loss, through failure, through nights when the mask had felt heavier than the world beneath it. Yet responsibility in his own city had a shape he understood. Here, that shape was smeared, distorted, sold in bulk. He thought of the woman clutching her son, of the officers watching the sky, of the applause given for a rescue no one believed was real. A slow question began forming inside him, quiet but persistent. Could he still be the hero he had always been in a world where heroism itself had been rewritten into a product? He did not have an answer. Perhaps he would never have one. But he stood, pulled the mask back over his face, and let the wind test the edges of his suit. Somewhere out there, someone needed help. That much remained true even here. Below, an unmarked van slowed at the corner, its passenger already lifting a phone toward the fire escape. The lens captured a small red figure poised against a bruised violet sky, and a moment later that image began its journey across every screen in the city. The footage moved faster than any webline Peter had ever fired. By dawn, the video of the masked stranger stopping a convenience store robbery had passed through millions of phones. By mid-morning, it dominated every trending list in the country. The clip was short, only 40 seconds, yet something about it refused to loosen its grip. Perhaps it was the way the hero paused to check on the trembling clerk. Perhaps it was the small wave he offered before slipping away. Perhaps it was simply that no one had asked to be paid for the rescue, and in this city that alone qualified as a miracle. Inside Vought Tower, the mood was less admiring. Ashley Barrett stood before a wall of monitors, each screen showing a different angle of the same red and blue figure. Her hands trembled around a lukewarm coffee cup as analysts fed her numbers she did not want to hear. Engagement was up. Public sentiment was warm. Approval ratings for the unknown hero had climbed higher in 12 hours than any managed launch of the past decade, and none of it had come through Vought. Find out who owns him, she snapped at the room. Every hero belongs to someone. Track the suit, the webbing, the voice pattern. Somebody signed the paperwork. Somebody always signs the paperwork. Her staff scattered. Yet every search returned the same result. Nothing. No agent, no contract, no press release. The masked figure had simply appeared out of thin air, as if the city had grown him from its own quiet hunger. Several floors above, in a corner office paneled in cold marble, Homelander watched the same footage on a wide personal screen. His expression remained still, his posture relaxed, yet the muscle in his jaw pulsed at slow, deliberate intervals. He rewatched the moment when the stranger waved to the crowd, once, twice, a third time. The wave was small, almost bashful. Homelander did not understand it. In his experience, every gesture was a calculation. A wave was a signal to the cameras, a smile a message to the shareholders. Yet this stranger seemed to be waving at ordinary people as though they mattered on their own. He turned the screen off and stood in silence for a long time. Down at street level, Peter continued moving through the city, learning its rhythms with the patience of a stranger in a foreign country. He tried to keep a low profile, but low profiles rarely survive the internet. Wherever he stopped a purse snatcher or eased a stalled truck out of an intersection, phones followed. Clips multiplied, hashtags formed. A name began circulating, borrowed from the pattern on his mask, Spider-Man. He did not remember introducing himself. Perhaps the city had needed a word and reached for the nearest one. Behind a rain-streaked window across the avenue, Billy Butcher watched with a scowl carved deep into his face. He held a cheap cup of coffee in one hand and a pair of binoculars in the other, his coat draped over the chair beside him like a discarded second skin. "Another Supe," he muttered. "Another bloody Supe pretending to be Father Christmas." Mother's Milk stood behind him, arms folded. He has not taken a single sponsorship, no press appearance, no agent. That is not the Vought playbook. "They are getting cleverer, that is all," Butcher said. "The best lies wear kind faces." Kimiko sat cross-legged on the couch, sharpening a blade with the calm concentration of a monk. She glanced at the screen where the young hero was helping an elderly man carry groceries up a flight of stairs. Her hands paused for a heartbeat before returning to their steady work. Frenchie noticed. He always noticed. Huey stood near the doorway, arms wrapped around himself as though the room were colder than it was. He watched the screen with a different kind of attention. He had spent so long being told that his childhood heroes were fantasies, that goodness in a cape was a marketing trick. Yet here was a figure who moved like someone who had never read the marketing memo. Huey did not say it aloud, but a small, forgotten hope had begun to stir behind his ribs, and he was afraid to name it in case naming it broke it. That afternoon, Vought sent its offer through every channel it could find. Ashley recorded a personal video invitation. Executives leaked kind rumors to the press. A limousine idled outside a rooftop where cameras had last spotted the stranger. The message was simple. Come to the tower, meet the seven, sign with the greatest team of heroes the world had ever known. The offer promised wealth, protection, and a place at the highest table in the country. Peter refused. He did not shout it. He did not lecture. He simply did not come. The limousine waited until the driver grew bored. The executives waited until their patience curdled into insult. Somewhere in the marble office, Homelander heard the news through a subordinate who kept his eyes carefully on the floor. He said no, the man reported. Politely, politely, Homelander repeated. The word tasted foreign in his mouth. He had been refused before, but never gently. Refusal in his world came laced with fear or ambition, never with the soft absence of interest. He felt something small and ugly move inside him, a hairline crack in a mirror he had polished for years. Meanwhile, Peter continued his work. He pulled a child from the path of a delivery truck on 9th Avenue. He stayed with an elderly woman until paramedics arrived after her collapse on a subway platform. He carried a lost dog 3 blocks to a shaking teenager who wept into its fur. No cameras were invited. No sponsors approached. When strangers offered money, he refused with the same gentle smile he had learned from a man named Ben in a world that felt increasingly far away. Butcher watched all of it through a series of hidden lenses, waiting for the mask to slip, waiting for the moment the young hero would demand a favor, a payment, a promise. The moment never came. Days passed. The boys sat in their safe house, uneasy, unsettled, and slowly disarmed by a stranger who refused to behave like a villain. Finally, Butcher rose from his chair, coat in hand, jaw set. If the mask would not slip on its own, he intended to lift it himself. "Time we had a proper chat with our friendly neighborhood miracle," he said. "One way or another, I want to see what is under that hood." The rain had returned by the time Butcher found him. It fell in thin, patient sheets over the rooftops of Brooklyn, softening the edges of the world and turning the city lights into halos. Peter sat on the ledge of an abandoned brownstone, his mask pulled up just enough to expose his mouth as he ate a cheap sandwich he had bought with the last of the strange currency in his pocket. He looked tired in a way that had little to do with muscles. The door to the roof opened with a slow groan, and Butcher stepped into the wet air as though he owned it. He carried no weapon in his hands, though Peter could smell the metal under his coat. Behind him came Mother's Milk, then Frenchie, then Kimiko, then Huey, who lingered near the doorway with an expression that hovered between fear and fascination. "Evening," Butcher said. His voice was almost polite. "Mind if we join you?" Peter lowered the sandwich. "There is not much of a view tonight. There never is in this city." Butcher walked to the ledge and leaned against it, close enough to be neighborly, far enough to strike. He studied the young man beside him. He had expected arrogance. He had expected a preening god who spoke in slogans. Instead, he saw a kid in a homemade suit, chewing bread and cheese, staring at a skyline he did not recognize. "You are new," Butcher said. "Very," Peter answered. "Not from around here. Not even close." Frenchie stepped forward with a small handheld device, and Peter allowed him to scan a droplet of the webbing on his wrist. The Frenchman's eyebrows climbed steadily as the reading scrolled across the screen. Organic, non lethal, biodegradable, no compound V signature, no corporate marker, no manufacturer imprint. It read like something a lonely genius might invent in a bedroom laboratory, rather than something produced in a boardroom. "This is not Vought," Frenchie murmured. "This is not anything I have seen." Mother's Milk watched Peter's posture, the way he balanced without effort, the way his shoulders tracked every subtle sound around the roof. He recognized the readiness of someone who had fought many battles, yet the softness of someone who still felt guilty about each one. He filed the contradiction away. Kimiko did nothing but watch. Her stillness carried weight. She noticed the sandwich, the tired eyes, the small hesitation before Peter answered any question, as though every word had to pass a private inspection. When he offered her the second half of the sandwich without a word, She took it. She did not eat it. She simply held it, as if surprised that someone would offer. Butcher folded his arms. So who signs your paychecks? Nobody. Who tells you who to save? Nobody. And you are asking me to believe that? I am not asking you to believe anything, Peter said quietly. I am just telling you what is true. Butcher's mouth twitched, an expression that in other men might have become a smile. Instead, he turned and gestured. Come with us. We have something you need to see. If you are what you say you are, then you deserve to know what you have walked into. And if you are not, well, then you deserve that too. Peter followed. The safe house was cramped and stale, its walls covered in photographs, maps, and lines of red string that traced patterns of suffering across the country. Butcher led him through the images without softening any of them. Villages erased in single incidents blamed on gas leaks. Airliners downed by men who could fly. Whistleblowers found in bathtubs. Compound V injected into infants marketed as medical miracles. Documents stamped by the same corporate logo that grinned from every billboard in the city. Peter's breathing changed. Not sharply, not dramatically, but the way a river changes when it meets colder water. Huey stood beside him and spoke for the first time. His voice cracked at the beginning and steadied only near the end. I lost someone. A hero was speeding through a crowd. He did not stop. He did not even slow down. Her name was Robin. She was standing right next to me. And then she was not there anymore. And nobody was punished. Nobody was even embarrassed. There was a press release. Peter looked at him for a long time. I am sorry, he said. The words were small. They did not try to be more than what they were. Butcher watched carefully. It was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when a soup usually revealed the shape underneath. A flicker of impatience, a subtle boredom. A quiet reminder that gods were not required to grieve alongside mortals. Instead, he saw a young man press his palms flat against a table because his hands had begun to shake. Homelander, Butcher said. That is the one at the center of it, the strongest of them. The face of the whole rotten thing. He smiles like a Sunday preacher and burns holes through people when the cameras are off. He is not a hero. He is a weapon that learned to wave. Peter closed his eyes. In his own city, monsters had claws or scales or laughter that peeled paint from walls. He had learned to recognize them, to fight them, to forgive himself when he failed to save everyone in their path. But here the monsters wore the same colors he did. They stood on stages. They were beloved. Children carried their lunchboxes to school. I have fought many things, he said softly. But I do not know how to fight a lie that everyone has agreed to believe. Welcome to our world, Butcher said. There was no cruelty in it. For a moment, only weariness. Frenchie set a small cup of coffee in front of Peter without a word. Mother's Milk sat down across from him and asked, in a voice softer than his frame suggested, where he was from. Peter tried to explain. He spoke of a city that looked like this one and yet was nothing like it. He spoke of an uncle who had died teaching him a single sentence that he still recited on difficult nights. He spoke of responsibility and of the private terror of realizing that responsibility alone might not be enough to repair a world this broken. Huey listened with his whole body. When Peter finished, he wiped his eyes on his sleeve and pretended he had not. Kimiko finally ate the sandwich. It was, in its own quiet way, a verdict. Outside, somewhere far above, a flash of light passed across the clouds, slow and deliberate, as though a red, white, and blue star had decided to circle the block. Butcher looked up through the window and exhaled. He knows you are here, he said. He is coming to meet you himself. Homelander did not arrive quietly. He never did. He descended from the clouds in a slow, luxurious arc, choosing the busiest square in the city as his landing pad. Reporters had been alerted an hour in advance. Cameras were positioned at flattering angles. A crowd had been gently corralled behind velvet ropes by Vought staff wearing polite smiles and earpieces. When his boots touched the pavement, the entire block trembled with orchestrated awe. Peter stood across from him in his simple red and blue suit, hands loose at his sides. He had not asked for this meeting. Vought had staged it, and refusing would have looked worse than attending. He had learned that quickly. In this world, an empty chair was a headline. There he is, Homelander said, and his voice slipped through the microphones like warm honey. The mystery man of Manhattan, our brand new friend. He offered a handshake. The crowd cheered on cue. Peter took the hand because to refuse it in front of children with painted faces would have felt like cruelty. Homelander's grip was firm, careful, calibrated. He could have crushed every bone in the young hero's hand without breaking his smile. He did not. He wanted to see how Peter would react to being held on a leash he could not see. "Nice to meet you," Peter said. His voice, filtered through the mask, sounded younger than the situation deserved. "Oh, the pleasure is mine," Homelander answered. "We have been watching you. You have quite the following now. People love a mystery, and I understand that." He drew closer, close enough that no camera could capture what passed between their eyes. His whisper was almost tender. "You have talent, kid. Real talent. But talent alone does not last in this city. You need a team. You need friends. You need people who understand how the game is played." "I am not really a game player," Peter answered, matching the quiet. "Everyone is a game player. Some just do not know it yet." He stepped back, spread his arms, and let the cameras drink him in. His voice returned to the golden pitch reserved for prime time. "On behalf of Vought International and the Seven, I would like to formally invite our new friend to join the greatest team of heroes the world has ever known." The crowd erupted. Somewhere a marching band began playing. Confetti drifted down from a nearby rooftop as though the sky itself had been paid to celebrate. Peter waited until the noise had softened. Then he answered as gently as he could. "Thank you, truly, but I am going to have to say no." For an instant, the smile on Homelander's face did not move. It stayed exactly where it had been, hovering above his teeth like a mask that had forgotten to blink. His pupils shrank. A ripple of red slid across his irises and vanished before the cameras could catch it. Peter felt it, though. His senses had been prickling since the moment Homelander landed. A low hum along the back of his neck. Now the hum sharpened into a warning bell. Everything in this man was a performance except the eyes. The eyes were something else, something hungry and unfinished. The eyes of a child who had been given godlike power before he had been taught how to be a person. Homelander recovered fast. "Well, that is disappointing, but I respect it. Independence has its charms." "I appreciate that," Peter said. "I only hope," Homelander continued, and now his voice carried the faintest edge, sharpened, just enough for the microphones to hear his sincerity and for Peter to hear his threat, "that our new friend understands how dangerous this city can be. New York eats lonely heroes for breakfast. It would be a shame if anything happened to him before we had a chance to work together properly." "I have been eaten for breakfast before," Peter said, smiling behind his mask. "I always come back for lunch." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. It was the wrong sound at the wrong moment, and Homelander felt it as a slap. Nobody had laughed at him in public in years. He glanced toward the audience, and the laughter died as quickly as it had come, but not quickly enough. He had heard it. Peter had heard it too. They shook hands again for the cameras. The photographs would run in every paper in the country the next morning. In every image, two figures stood side by side, one gleaming in stars and stripes, the other in humble red and blue. To the untrained eye, they were allies. To anyone paying attention, they were opposing colors on the same battlefield. Later, back on the rooftop where the meeting had been arranged to end, Homelander lingered a moment longer than the schedule required. The crowd had been ushered away. The cameras had been switched off. Only a handful of Vought security remained, and they were pretending very hard to be somewhere else. "You do not understand what I am offering you," Homelander said. His voice had lost its television polish. It sounded thinner now and colder. "I am giving you a family. I am giving you a home. In this world, that is the only currency worth anything." "I already have a home," Peter said quietly. "It is just very far away. Homes can be replaced. Not the good ones." Homelander stared at him. There was a long silence, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of a car alarm 3 streets over. In that silence, Peter understood something that changed the shape of his fear. Homelander was not simply a bully with power. He was a wound. He was every terrible thing that could happen to a boy who had never once been told no by someone he could not destroy. And the boy inside him was still there, still watching, still furious that the universe had failed to worship him properly. "You will regret this," Homelander said, softly, almost sadly. "Maybe," Peter said, "but I will still sleep." Homelander rose slowly into the air, cape catching the wind, and vanished into the low gray clouds without another word. Peter stayed on the rooftop for a long time, listening to the city breathe. Somewhere in a corner office lined with cold marble, a phone was already ringing. Ashley Barrett answered it with a hand that had not stopped shaking since morning. Homelander's voice on the other end was calm, almost pleasant, which was always the worst version of him. "I want him ruined," he said. "Not killed, not yet. Ruined. I want the world to hate him before he ever gets a chance to be loved." The order traveled through the building faster than any elevator. By the time Peter reached the ground, the machinery of his destruction had already begun to turn. The first false story appeared before dawn. It ran on a small news site that specialized in outrage, then jumped to a larger network within the hour. Then to television by breakfast. By noon, the entire country had heard it. Spider-Man, the mysterious vigilante of Manhattan, was under investigation for endangering civilians during his so-called rescues. Anonymous witnesses had come forward. Blurry photographs had been analyzed. Experts wearing crisp suits offered grave opinions on national broadcasts. None of it was true. All of it was believable. Peter watched the coverage through the cracked screen of a diner television, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him. A woman in a tailored blazer explained to viewers that the masked stranger had refused to cooperate with authorities, that he wore no official emblem, that his motives were unknown. A grainy clip played on loop, edited just enough to make his webline look like a weapon aimed at a fleeing child rather than a rope catching her mid-fall. The waitress refilled his cup without meeting his eyes. She had recognized him. She did not say anything. She simply set a small paper bag beside his plate, filled with a sandwich she had not charged him for, and moved on. It was a small kindness in a very loud storm. Vought pushed harder over the following days. Homelander appeared on morning talk shows and expressed concern with the practiced sadness of a man who had rehearsed sorrow in a mirror. He spoke of his own attempts to reach out to the young hero, of his disappointment at being refused. He mentioned danger. He mentioned instability. He mentioned, with the tenderness of a priest, the possibility that this stranger might not be a hero at all, but something else, something planted, something foreign, something that ought to be watched carefully by patriots. Fake footage bloomed across social media like weeds after rain. In one clip, Spider-Man appeared to threaten a police officer. In another, he seemed to laugh as a car exploded behind him. Deepfakes had reached a delicate art in this world, and Vought owned most of the artists. Ordinary citizens who had never met Peter began to argue about him at dinner tables, in bars, in barber shops, in kitchens. Members of the Seven joined the hunt. AD pretended to lead search efforts along the harbor. A train ran through the streets at intervals designed to look like patrols. A newer member, freshly minted for the cameras, promised to bring the vigilante to justice. Homelander himself gave a speech on the steps of Vought Tower, thanking the American people for their vigilance and reminding them that heroes existed to keep them safe from unregistered threats. Peter did not fight back with words. He had no platform. He had no press office. He had no marketing team. He had only the streets in his hands, so he kept using them. He caught a bus mid-roll after its brakes failed on a steep avenue, holding its front end steady with a strand of webbing anchored to a distant crane. He crawled into a burning tenement in Queens and carried an old man down 5 flights of stairs while flames licked at his shoulder blades. He talked a teenager down from the edge of a bridge at 3 a.m, sitting beside him with his mask off just enough to show tired human eyes. He never once raised a hand against a Vought hero, never once retaliated against the smear campaign, never once said an unkind word into any camera. The city began to notice the contradiction. If he was the monster Vought described, why did the woman he saved from a hit-and-run remember him whispering, "Easy, easy, I have you"? If he was a threat to civilians, why did the little boy pull from the burning building tell reporters that the man in the red mask had promised his mother he would be safe? If he was a foreign danger, why did he keep speaking English with the accent of a kid from Forest Hills? Slowly, quietly, in ways that were difficult to measure and impossible to suppress, doubt began to spread. Children were the first to move. They had never trusted Vought quite the way their parents did, and they possessed a stubborn moral compass that no marketing budget could bend. A girl in Harlem drew a red and blue mask on a paper bag and wore it to school. A boy in Brooklyn painted a small web pattern across the back of his backpack. Within a week, a homemade Spider-Man mask had appeared in nearly every classroom in the borough. teachers were told to confiscate them. The teachers mostly did not. Murals began to appear on the sides of buildings. They were rough at first, the work of teenagers with spray cans and better intentions than technique. Yet the images spread. A hero crouched on a rooftop under a bleeding sky. A hero pulling a child from a wreck. A hero waving, small and shy, to a crowd that did not know yet whether to believe him. Vought sent cleaning crews. The murals returned overnight. Some appeared in places even the cleaning crews could not reach, high on walls and bridges, as though the city itself had begun tagging its own skin with new symbols. In his safe house, Butcher watched the shift on a bank of monitors and let out a laugh that surprised even him. "The bloody kid is doing it," he muttered. "He is doing it without a single punch to Homelander's face." Mother's Milk allowed himself a small smile. "He is doing it because he never wanted to punch Homelander's face." Frenchie raised a glass to no one in particular. Kimiko drew a tiny web pattern on the back of Huey's hand with a marker while he pretended not to notice, and then pretended not to be moved. In the tower, Homelander watched the same murals through the window of his private office and felt something unfamiliar coiling in his stomach. It took him a long time to recognize it because he had never truly felt it before. It was the beginning of fear. Every dictator in history had understood a single quiet truth. Fear was the foundation of control. Fear made citizens obedient, cameras friendly, journalists quiet. Fear was the fuel that kept his throne warm. And fear was slowly being drained from the city, one child in a homemade mask at a time. He turned from the window and spoke to the empty room in a voice that was almost calm. "Enough games," he said. "Enough press. Enough patience." His reflection in the glass smiled without him. "If they will not fear me on their own," he whispered, "then I will remind them why they should." The order came down in the middle of the night, disguised as a press event. Vought announced a coordinated operation to bring the dangerous vigilante to justice. Every member of the Seven would participate. Every network would broadcast live. The city was told to remain indoors. The world was told to watch. Peter had known it was coming. His senses had been humming for 2 full days, and Butcher had confirmed the details through a source inside the tower. He did not sleep the night before. He sat on the roof of the safe house and looked at the sky, breathing slowly, remembering the faces of everyone he had failed to save in every world he had ever lived in. There were more than he liked to count. He counted them anyway. It felt like the least he could do for them. At sunrise, the Seven arrived in formation over Midtown. A train blurred across the pavement. The Deep waited near the harbor with grim professionalism. Black Noir stood motionless on a rooftop like a shadow that had learned patience. A newer member hovered above them, freshly televised, freshly convinced of his own destiny. Homelander himself did not appear. He watched from a private balcony miles above, a glass of champagne in his hand, savoring what he believed would be a public execution dressed as justice. Peter met them alone. He landed in the middle of an intersection cleared by police, hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender, mask calm, posture patient. The crowd behind the barricades held its breath. Millions more held it through their screens. "I am not going to fight you," Peter said, loud enough for the microphones. "I do not want anyone hurt. Not you, not me, not the people watching." A train answered him by charging. Peter did not strike back. He stepped, twisted, and let the speedster's momentum carry him into a parked truck. The impact was harmless. A train sat down in a daze, unable to remember which direction the wind was blowing. Peter had already moved. He caught the deep mid-dive with a strand of webbing that pinned his wrists to a lamppost, gently enough that the man had to blink twice before realizing he had lost. The newer hero swung a heavy fist that would have leveled a bus. Peter ducked, redirected the strike into a concrete pillar, and left the man staring at his own hand as though it had betrayed him. He did not kill. He did not maim. He did not even mock. He simply outthought them, one by one, moving through them the way water moves through a broken dam. And with every second the world watched, a quiet truth began to reveal itself. The Seven were not skilled. They were feared. Their power had been enormous, but their craft had been thin because they had never truly needed craft. Fear had done their fighting for them. The battle spread across 10 city blocks. It should have been a slaughter. Instead, it became a lesson. Halfway through, a bus overturned during a stray impact from A-Train's recovery. Peter left the fight without hesitation. He tore the roof open, lifted a woman out first, then a schoolchild in uniform, then an elderly couple who clung to each other so tightly that he carried them both in one arm. He set them down behind the barricade and returned to the battle before Vought's cameras could edit the interruption away. The moment played on every broadcast within seconds. A hero, hunted by the world's most powerful protectors, had stopped mid-conflict to rescue the very civilians those protectors were supposedly defending. Black Noir attacked next. He was a different animal, silent and precise, a blade dressed in a costume. Peter felt him only through the whisper of displaced air, and their fight was the longest of the day. They moved through alleys, across rooftops, along the sides of buildings. Peter was faster. Noir was more experienced. Yet even here, Peter refused to strike lethally. When at last he cornered the assassin against a water tower and could have ended him with a single blow, he instead webbed his hands and feet and stepped back. "I am not the enemy you were trained to fight," Peter said quietly. "I hope one day you get to choose a better one." Noir did not answer because Noir did not answer anyone. But something in the way his shoulders lowered suggested that the words had landed somewhere he was not expecting. By the time the newer hero finally fell, bound in webs beside a public fountain, the city had already begun to change. Crowds that had been told to stay indoors had drifted to their windows anyway. From high above, the streets looked like fields of open blossoms, each window a small face pressed to the glass, each face watching the same impossible thing. A young man in a homemade suit, outnumbered and hunted, refusing to become the monster he was accused of being. The narrative that Vought had spent millions of dollars to construct began to crack in real time. Anchors on television struggled to follow the script. Some abandoned it entirely. One veteran journalist, tears in her eyes on a live broadcast, set down her prepared cards and simply said, "We have been lied to." It became the most replayed sentence of the year. In his balcony miles above, Homelander watched the champagne go still in his glass. He watched his seven fall one after another, not killed, not humiliated in blood, but gently, thoroughly, publicly outclassed by a young man who had refused to become like them. He watched the crowds cheer, first hesitantly, then openly, then with a joy he had not heard directed at anyone but himself in more than a decade. The champagne glass cracked in his hand. He did not notice. Below, Peter stood in the ruined street, chest heaving, mask torn at the shoulder, surrounded by the fallen figures of the world's most feared heroes. Not one of them was dead. Not one of them was even seriously injured. Around him, civilians began stepping past the barricades. A child broke free from her mother's hand and ran forward, holding a small paper mask she had drawn herself. Peter knelt to accept it. He held it as if it were made of glass. Somewhere far above, Homelander finally moved. He rose slowly into the sky, cape catching the wind, his face lit not by television lights but by rage. The Seven had been his shield. His shield was gone. Only he remained. He would have to descend himself. He would have to do it in front of the world. And for the first time in his life, as he flew toward the young man in the red and blue suit, he felt the very smallest possibility that he might not win. The sky darkened before Homelander reached the ground. It was not a natural darkening. Clouds gathered around him as he descended, drawn by the sheer heat of his fury, and the air itself seemed to lean away from his shoulders. He landed 20 feet from Peter, boots cracking the pavement in a small crater, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The crowd behind the barricades had gone silent. Even the cameras felt hushed, though they continued to record. Somewhere in an editing bay, a producer was quietly weeping over what he was watching, because he knew that no amount of manipulation would ever bury this footage. It was too clear. It was too honest. It was already history. "You should have taken the deal," Homelander said. His voice was low, almost intimate. He had shed the television polish entirely. What remained was smaller and older, the voice of a boy who had never been allowed to lose. "I never wanted a deal," Peter answered. "I just wanted to help. Nobody helps for free. That is because nobody has taught you what free looks like." Homelander moved first, because Homelander always moved first. He crossed the distance between them faster than sound, faster than sight, faster than Peter's own reflexes had ever measured. Yet somehow Peter was not there when he arrived. A shift of the hips, a twist of the shoulders, A strand of webbing anchored to a distant crane, and the young hero was already spiraling upward through the sky, dragging his opponent's attention with him. They fought across the skyline of the city like two comets refusing to fall. Homelander's fists cracked steel beams and shattered glass. Peter dodged, wove, redirected. Each of Homelander's strikes could have ended him. None of them landed cleanly. He was too fast, too experienced, too used to being outclassed in strength and outsmarting the difference. Homelander was a hurricane. Peter was a river. The hurricane roared. The river simply refused to stop moving. Buildings fell in glancing blows. Peter caught more of them than he broke. When Homelander's laser vision melted a section of a residential tower, Peter left the fight without hesitation to catch the falling debris, cradling entire slabs of concrete on strands of webbing while civilians fled below. Homelander stood in the sky above, watching, incredulous, offended. "You are wasting time," Homelander shouted. "You are supposed to be fighting me." "I am," Peter answered from below, straining under the weight of a wall. "This is what fighting you looks like." Homelander did not understand. That was the thing that finally began to shake him. He had spent his entire life defining strength as the ability to end other lives. Yet here was a boy who defined strength as the ability to preserve them, and by every measure the boy was winning the public. The crowds were not cheering Homelander's blows. They were cheering Peter's rescues. The battle carried them into a wide plaza where a fountain still bubbled absurdly through the wreckage. Homelander caught Peter at last, a single blow to the ribs that cracked something deep and important. Peter tumbled across the pavement, tasting blood inside his mask, and did not immediately rise. Homelander walked toward him slowly, cape torn, hair wild, smile returning as it always did in the presence of a fallen enemy. "Get up," Homelander said. "Get up so the world can watch you fall again." Peter got up, slowly, painfully, but he got up. "Why?" Homelander asked, and there was something almost pleading in the question now. "Why keep standing? You cannot beat me. You know that. Everyone knows that." Peter wiped blood from his chin and looked at him for a long time. "I am not standing because I think I can beat you," he said. "I am standing because there is a child 3 streets over who is watching this on a television, and I do not want the last thing she sees me do to be lying down." Homelander flinched. It was small. It was almost invisible, yet Peter's senses caught it, and so did every camera pointed at his face. "Power does not make someone a hero," Peter continued. His voice was quiet, meant for one person and heard by billions. "Choices do. You have all the power in the world, and every day you choose to use it to make people smaller. That is not strength. That is the loudest kind of weakness there is." The words were not shouted. They were not weaponized. They were spoken with the plain, tired certainty of a young man who had thought about them for years. And they struck Homelander harder than any blow, because he had never in his life been criticized by someone who was not afraid of him. He roared and swung. Peter ducked. He roared and swung again. Peter turned the blow aside with a strand of webbing that anchored to Homelander's own wrist, redirecting the god's strength against a granite pillar that shattered like sugar. Homelander stood in the wreckage, panting, though he did not need to breathe. His eyes darted to the nearest camera. He tried, out of habit, to find a smile for it. The smile did not come. His face refused to obey him. Above the plaza, the sky had begun to clear. Sunlight fell in patient shafts across the ruined pavement. Peter stood in one of them, mask torn, ribs cracked, hands trembling with exhaustion, and yet somehow more solid than the god across from him. Homelander could see it. Everyone could see it. The crowd had learned in real time the shape of a truth that Vought had spent decades trying to hide from them. A cape did not make a hero. A logo did not make a hero. Power did not make a hero. Only the daily, unrewarded, unwatched choice to do the right thing made a hero. And by that measure, the tallest figure in the plaza was not the one wearing stars and stripes. Homelander looked at his own hands. They were shaking. They had never shaken before. "I could kill you," he whispered. "I know," Peter said gently. "You still can. And the whole world is watching to see whether you will." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. It felt much longer. In that silence, every viewer, every executive, every child in a paper mask, every officer on the beat, every reporter with a script saw Homelander choose. And every one of them saw him hesitate. He did not attack again. He rose into the sky instead, slowly, without grace, and vanished into the low gray clouds that had gathered above the city. The crown he had worn for so long slipped invisibly from his head as he flew. Peter dropped to one knee in the sunlight. A small girl in a homemade mask crossed the barricade and offered him her hand. He took it. She led him, gently, out of the plaza and into a city that was already beginning to remember how to breathe. The files came out that night. Butcher had been preparing them for years, hoarding evidence in dead drops across 3 continents, waiting for a moment when the world would finally be willing to look. He was not a sentimental man, but even he understood that a door only stayed open for a little while, and this door had been pried open by a boy in a homemade suit. He would not waste it. The release was simultaneous. Every major newspaper, every independent outlet, every social platform. Millions of documents, thousands of hours of footage, decades of quiet crimes suddenly loud. Compound V trials on infants. Villages incinerated by drunken Supes and covered by press statements about gas leaks. Politicians on payroll. Journalists silenced. The airliner that had never been an accident. The whistleblowers who had never really committed suicide. Homelander's private tantrums recorded in secret by staff who had lived their entire careers in fear. All of it, every rotten page. The world did not turn away this time. It could not. The pattern was too vast to dismiss, and the young man in the red mask had prepared its citizens to believe what they were seeing. Governments moved with the sudden panic of institutions that had been complicit for far too long. Committees were formed within hours. Assets were frozen within a day. Board members of Vought International attempted to flee and were quietly turned back at airports. Ashley Barrett appeared on television in a wrinkled blazer, reading a statement of resignation that her hands could barely hold, and did not finish reading it before walking off the set. The company's stock cratered so severely that trading was suspended in 3 markets before lunch. The 7 collapsed under their own weight. A train, exhausted by years of chemical dependence and quiet guilt, walked into a police station and asked to speak with someone. The Deep gave a rambling interview that surprised even the therapist who had encouraged it. Black Noir vanished entirely, leaving behind only a folded costume on a bench in a public park, as though he had finally chosen to be a person instead of a weapon. The newer members fled in various directions, some to lawyers, some to therapists, some to obscurity. Homelander himself had not been seen since his flight from the plaza. Peter watched most of it from a small apartment Frenchie had loaned him. He sat on a threadbare couch, ribs still taped, mask folded neatly on the coffee table beside a cup of tea he kept forgetting to drink. On the television, city after city erupted into something that was not quite celebration and not quite grief. It looked more like an exhale, a very long, very shaky exhale. Huey sat beside him, quiet for a long time. "I did not think I would live to see it," he finally said. "You did more than see it," Peter answered. "You helped make it." "So did you." "I only pulled at threads." "You people had been unraveling this thing for years." Huey shook his head slowly. "Threads are what unravels sweaters. You know that." Outside, the streets began to fill in ways that no algorithm could have predicted. Ordinary people stepped into intersections not to protest, but simply to help. Strangers formed chains to lift wreckage from the previous day's battle. Nurses opened clinics in church basements to treat injuries that had gone untreated for years. Teachers reopened schools that Vought's influence had quietly closed. Neighbors who had not spoken in a decade found themselves passing sandwiches across fences and pretending they had always been friends. Children were everywhere. They wore homemade masks and drew webs on their sleeves in colored pen. They organized themselves into small groups they called neighborhood watches, though the adults gently corrected the name to something less legally fraught. They picked up trash. They walked elderly residents across streets. They painted over Vought advertisements with murals of their own design. Some of the murals were of Spider-Man. Many were not. Many were of ordinary people. A woman carrying groceries up a stairwell. A man handing a coat to a stranger in the rain. A nurse holding the hand of a patient with no family in the room. Peter walked among them in ordinary clothes on the 3rd day, hood pulled low, hands in his pockets. Nobody recognized him. Everybody recognized him. He was not sure how both could be true at once, and yet they were. A boy on a curb was showing his little sister how to draw a web pattern in chalk. Peter crouched beside them for a moment, corrected the boy's grip on the chalk, and moved on before either of them had truly registered his presence. The web, when finished, was uneven and beautiful. At the safe house, Butcher watched the transformation of the city with a scowl that did not quite hide what was underneath it. Mother's Milk found him standing at the window one evening, arms folded, jaw set, eyes wet in a way that neither man would ever mention aloud. "You did good, Billy," Mother's Milk said quietly. "I did nothing," Butcher grumbled. "The kid did it. The kid did some of it. You did the rest." Butcher did not answer. He simply took a long swallow of tea, which was surprising in itself, and continued looking out the window at a city that no longer belonged to Homelander. Peter came to understand, over those days, a truth he had not fully grasped before. He had believed for most of his life that heroism was measured in villains defeated. Yet, what he had done here was not that. Homelander was not defeated. He was diminished. Vought was not destroyed. It was exposed. The real work had happened in the streets, in the classrooms, in the kitchens, in the quiet decisions of millions of ordinary people to no longer be afraid. He had not saved the world. He had reminded it that it was allowed to save itself. The lesson felt heavy. It also felt like grace. Kimiko wrote him a note on the fourth evening. She could not speak, but her handwriting was careful and clear. "Thank you for showing my hands another use." He read it, folded it, and placed it inside the small compartment of his suit where he kept the few things he never wanted to lose. Uncle Ben's photograph was already there. There was room enough for both. On the fifth day, the sky above the harbor shivered. A soft crackle of light appeared at the horizon, faint at first, then steadier, then unmistakable. Peter felt it before he saw it. A tremor along the edge of his senses, a pull he had not felt since the night he had first arrived. Somewhere between worlds, a door had reopened. Home was calling him back. The portal hovered above the harbor at sunset, a slow spiral of pale gold light no larger than a doorway. It did not roar. It did not tear. It simply waited, patient as a friend who had come to walk him home. Peter stood on the edge of a pier, mask in his hand, hair damp from the wind off the water, and looked at it for a long time before he could bring himself to move toward it. The boys had come to see him off. They had not made a plan of it. They had simply arrived one by one, as if the city itself had told them where to be. Butcher stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set in a way that pretended not to feel anything. Mother's Milk carried a small paper bag of sandwiches he had insisted on making himself. Frenchie held a bottle of wine he had been saving for what he had once believed would be his own funeral. Kimiko held Huey's hand, and Huey held hers back without pretending anymore that he was not moved by everything that had happened. Beyond them, further along the pier, a small crowd had gathered. Not a media crowd, not a Vought crowd, ordinary people, children in homemade masks. Parents holding phones, but holding them low. A veteran officer who had removed his cap, a nurse from a nearby clinic. A boy Peter had once pulled from a burning apartment, standing beside a mother who had wept into his shoulder for an hour afterward. They did not cheer. They simply watched. They had learned in the past week that some moments deserve to be witnessed rather than performed. "Do not make a speech," Butcher warned. "If you make a speech, I will personally throw you into that portal." "I was not going to," Peter said. "Good. That is the first sensible thing you have said since we met." Peter laughed softly. It surprised him. He had not expected to laugh today. Huey stepped forward. He carried a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly. It was a handmade Spider-Man mask, stitched together from mismatched fabric by a child in one of the shelters they had been helping. Uneven, bright. "Loved, she wanted you to have one," Huey said. "In case you ever forget." "Forget what?" "That you did this. When it gets hard in your own world, that you did this." Peter took the mask carefully, folded it, and slipped it into the compartment beside Uncle Ben's photograph and Kimiko's note. There was still room. Perhaps there always would be. Perhaps that was what a good pocket was for. He turned to the others. He did not have anything grand to say to them. He did not think grand things would fit the moment, so he said, simply, "Thank you for letting me help." "Thank you for reminding us it was still possible," Mother's Milk said. "Thank you for the sandwiches," Peter added. Mother's Milk allowed himself a small smile. He had needed that one. Kimiko stepped forward and hugged Peter without warning. It lasted only a moment. When she let go, she signed a single word to him, which Frenchie quietly translated, family. Peter nodded, unable to speak for a second, and then found his voice again. Look after each other, he said. The world here will need you for a long time yet. Homelander is not gone. Vought will not disappear cleanly. There will be more nights like the ones you have already lived through. Be gentle with yourselves in between. Save the speeches, kid, Butcher muttered. But his voice cracked at the edge, and he looked away toward the water so that nobody would see it. Peter pulled on his mask. The city behind him glowed in the low gold light of evening. Its windows were full of ordinary people going about ordinary lives, protected for a little while by a peace they had helped to build. He looked at it once more, memorizing the shape of it. Somewhere, a child pointed. Somewhere, a phone lifted. But most of the crowd simply stood in silence, hands over their hearts or at their sides, or gripping the shoulders of the people they had come with. Peter fired a strand of webbing into the sky, tested its anchor, and swung once across the pier before releasing into the light. The portal accepted him gently, like a friend guiding him through a doorway. For a moment his silhouette hung inside the gold. Then it was gone. The portal folded closed behind him with a soft breath, and the harbor was quiet again. The boys stood on the pier for a long time before anyone spoke. Frenchie opened the wine. They passed it in silence. Even Butcher took a sip, though he pretended it was only to be polite. Life went on. It always did. The murals continued to spread. The children continued to wear their homemade masks. Committees rewrote laws. Vought's tower was renamed and given to a public health service. The Seven's old suits ended up in a museum, and children pressed their noses against the glass and asked their parents why anyone had ever been afraid of costumes. The parents did not always have good answers. In another universe, in a city that looked almost identical, a young man landed on a rusted water tower and pulled off his mask to breathe familiar air. He carried a folded photograph, a handwritten note, and a small handmade mask stitched by a child he would never see again. He tucked them all into the compartment over his heart and looked out across a skyline that had never learned to be afraid of its heroes. He did not know, and would never know for certain, what happened to the world he had left behind. He only knew that he had believed, for a little while, that people were worth showing up for, and that somewhere in a different sky, other people had decided to believe it too. That, he understood at last, was the truest superpower he had ever carried. Not strength, not speed, not the webs at his wrists. Only the quiet, stubborn certainty that every life mattered, and that hope, once awakened in a world that had forgotten it, was stronger than any fear that had ever tried to rule.